You think you know how World War II ended, the grand narratives, the heroic generals, the decisive battles etched into history books. But what if I told you the war was rigged? What if the outcome wasn't determined solely on bloodied beaches or in the skies above burning cities, but in shadowy rooms where men and women played the most dangerous game ever conceived? This is the story of the unseen architects, the double agents who didn't just observe history, they rewrote it. And their methods were so effective, so brilliantly deceptive, that the truth remained buried for decades. Picture a map room in Berlin, 1943. German high command huddles over intelligence reports, making decisions that will cost thousands of lives. They believe they're acting on solid information. They're convinced their intelligence network is feeding them the truth. But every word, every supposed fact has been carefully crafted by the enemy. The generals think they're playing chess, but they don't realize the board itself is fake. How did this happen? How did the Allies manage to turn Germany's own intelligence apparatus into a weapon against them? The answer begins long before the first bombs fell, in the murky world of espionage, where loyalty was a commodity and betrayal an art form. Intelligence agencies on both sides understood something fundamental about modern warfare. The war wouldn't just be won with tanks and planes, it would be won with information, or more precisely, with disinformation. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of simply gathering secrets, what if you could control what your enemy believed? What if you could make them see phantom armies, believe false invasion plans, and commit their forces to defending the wrong beaches? This wasn't theoretical speculation. This was Operation Double Cross, and it would become one of the most audacious gambits in military history. But building such a network required something extraordinary, finding people willing to betray their countries, or at least appear to, while secretly serving the Allied cause. The recruitment process was an art unto itself. Some were ideological converts, others were caught and turned under threat of execution. A few were simply mercenaries, willing to play both sides for the right price. But the most effective? They were the true believers, men and women who understood that lying to the enemy wasn't just acceptable, it was essential. Consider the sheer psychological warfare required to maintain such a deception. These agents had to convince hardened German intelligence officers that they were genuine. One slip, one inconsistent detail, and they'd face torture and execution. The training was intensive. They learned to think like their fictitious personas, to react authentically under pressure. Some lived double lives for years, maintaining cover stories so elaborate they became second nature. The stress was unimaginable. You're feeding false information to the enemy, knowing that if you're discovered, you'll be killed. But you also know that if you succeed, you might save thousands of Allied lives. The early operations were tests, small-scale deceptions designed to gauge whether the Germans were actually believing the intelligence being fed to them. In 1941, a minor operation provided false information about a British convoy route. German U-boats repositioned based on this intelligence, and the convoy passed safely. It was a small victory, but it proved something crucial. The system worked. The Germans were taking the bait. This realization changed everything. If small deceptions worked, what about larger ones? What if you could deceive the enemy about entire military campaigns? The machinery of deception began to grow. The British formed the 20 Committee, named for the Roman numerals 20, representing the double cross. This committee would coordinate the activities of every double agent operating against Germany. Their meetings were conducted with absolute secrecy. Every piece of intelligence had to be carefully calibrated. Feed the Germans too much false information, and they'd become suspicious. Give them too many accurate details to maintain credibility, and you'd compromise actual operations. It was a razor's edge, and the consequences of failure were catastrophic. What made these early successes so remarkable was the Germans' own confidence. They believed their intelligence network was superior. They'd invested heavily in espionage, and they trusted their agents implicitly. This arrogance became their weakness when their spies, now secretly working for the Allies, sent reports confirming German biases. The information was accepted without sufficient skepticism. The 20 Committee exploited this perfectly. They understood German psychology, their expectations, their fears, and they crafted deceptions that played directly into those preconceptions. But here's what's truly shocking. The stakes were about to get exponentially higher. What began as tactical deceptions would soon expand into strategic manipulations that would affect the entire course of the war. The question wasn't whether double agents could feed false information anymore. The question became, could they actually change where Germany deployed its forces? Could they manipulate Hitler himself? The answer would come in the form of the most elaborate military deception ever conceived. An operation so vast, so intricate, that it required the creation of entire fictional armies. Armies with tanks that were really inflatable rubber. Divisions that existed only on paper and in radio transmissions. This was Operation Fortitude, and it would determine the fate of D-Day. Imagine being a German intelligence analyst in early 1944. You know the Allies are planning to invade Europe. The question is where and when. Your career, perhaps your life, depends on getting this right. Reports flood in from agents across Britain. They describe massive troop buildups in southeastern England. They detail preparations for an assault on Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. The evidence is overwhelming. Aerial reconnaissance seems to confirm it. You report up the chain of command with confidence. You've done your job, except you haven't, because everything you believe is a lie. The architects of Fortitude understood that creating a convincing deception required more than just false reports. It required physical evidence that German reconnaissance could verify. So they built fake installations across southeastern England, inflatable tanks that looked real from the air, dummy landing craft that could withstand photographic scrutiny. They generated radio traffic consistent with genuine military units, creating an electronic signature that German signals intelligence would intercept. The scale was breathtaking. They invented entire armies, complete with fictional commanders and fabricated histories. Hit that subscribe button, because what comes next will change how you see military history forever. The linchpin of Fortitude was the double agents themselves, and none was more crucial than Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. This Spanish national had originally approached the British offering his services as a spy. They rejected him. Undeterred, he approached the Germans, who accepted. Then he began sending them intelligence reports from Britain, despite never having set foot in the country. He invented a network of fictional sub-agents and crafted reports based on nothing more than a travel guide and his own imagination. The Germans believed every word. When the British finally realized what he was doing, they recruited him immediately. Garbo's genius was his attention to detail. His reports were long, meandering, filled with mundane observations that made them feel authentic. He complained about British weather, griped about rationing, and peppered his dispatches with the kind of trivial information that genuine agents would naturally include. The Germans trusted him completely. By the time D-Day approached, he had established himself as their most valuable asset in Britain. What he told them, they believed. And what he told them was exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. In the weeks leading up to the Normandy invasion, Garbo sent a series of reports confirming the Pas-de-Calais story. He described preparations he'd supposedly witnessed, movements of troops, gathering of supplies. Each report was carefully timed, calibrated by the 20 Committee to reinforce German preconceptions. Other double agents added their voices to the chorus. Tricycle, another highly trusted agent, provided corroborating details. The Germans now had multiple sources telling them the same thing. In intelligence work, this is gold, multiple independent sources confirming the same information, except none of them were independent, and all of them were controlled by the same handlers. The psychological manipulation was profound. German high command wanted to believe Pas-de-Calais was the target. It was the logical choice, the shortest route across the Channel. The double agents weren't fighting German assumptions, they were validating them. This made the deception far more effective than if they'd tried to sell an obviously unexpected invasion point. They were telling the Germans what they already wanted to hear, confirming biases rather than challenging them. It's a principle that works just as effectively today in propaganda and disinformation campaigns. Here's where it gets even more remarkable. The Allies knew they couldn't prevent the Germans from eventually learning about the Normandy landings once they began. The deception had to survive first contact with reality, so they planned for it. When Allied forces hit the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, Garbo sent an urgent message. He'd been correct about an invasion, he reported, but he'd gotten the location wrong based on incomplete information. However, he now had intelligence suggesting this was merely a feint. The real invasion, the main thrust, would still come at Pas-de-Calais. The Germans needed to hold their reserves in place. And incredibly, they believed him. Panzer divisions that could have been rushed to Normandy remained stationed near Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Hitler himself, convinced by the reports from his trusted agents, refused to release these critical reserves. By the time German High Command realized their mistake, the Allies had established an unbreakable foothold in France. The deception had worked beyond anyone's most optimistic predictions. The impact cannot be overstated. Military historians have calculated that if those panzer divisions had been deployed to Normandy in the first 48 hours, they could have pushed the Allies back into the sea. D-Day could have been a catastrophic failure. The entire trajectory of the war would have changed. Instead, the largest amphibious invasion in history succeeded, and the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany was written not just by brave soldiers on beaches, but by the cunning manipulation of Hitler's own intelligence network. But Fortitude wasn't the only game in play. The tentacles of deception reached far beyond the beaches of Normandy. In North Africa, another theatre of lies was being constructed, one that would help determine the fate of an entire continent. North Africa, 1942. The Desert War swung back and forth like a pendulum, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had earned his reputation through tactical brilliance and aggressive maneuvering. He read the battlefield like few others could, but what if his understanding of that battlefield was being subtly distorted? What if the intelligence he relied upon was being poisoned at the source? Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, required absolute surprise. If Rommel anticipated the landings, he could position his forces to devastate the inexperienced American troops making their combat debut. The stakes were enormous. A failed invasion would not only cost thousands of lives, it would delay the European campaign indefinitely and potentially shake the fragile alliance between America and Britain. The double-agent network swung into action. Reports began flowing to German intelligence suggesting Allied intentions were focused elsewhere. The Mediterranean remained quiet in their intelligence assessments. Meanwhile, German agents, supposedly embedded in Allied command structures, fed information about troop movements toward other theaters. The picture being painted was of Allies preparing for operations in the Middle East, possibly even a strike toward the Caucasus oil fields. It fit German strategic assumptions. It made sense, and it was completely false. Like what you're hearing, there's so much more to uncover. Subscribe now. What made the North African deception particularly effective was its layering with genuine intelligence. The 20 Committee understood that pure fabrication would eventually be detected, so they mixed truth with lies, creating a mosaic where German analysts couldn't distinguish real tiles from fake ones. Yes, there were troop buildups in Britain. Yes, there was naval activity in the Mediterranean. But the interpretation of these facts was guided by the false context provided through double agents. The Germans saw what they expected to see because the frame through which they viewed the information had been carefully constructed. Rommel's logistics were particularly vulnerable to intelligence manipulation. Desert warfare is a supply nightmare. Every gallon of fuel, every shell, every drop of water must be transported across vast distances. Knowing where to position supplies, where to expect attacks, this was the difference between victory and defeat. The double agents fed information that led German logistics to make subtle but critical miscalculations. Supplies were positioned for battles that never came. Reinforcements were held in reserve for attacks that materialized elsewhere. Each small error compounded. When Operation Torch launched in November 1942, German forces were caught fundamentally off balance. The strategic surprise was nearly complete, and while Rommel fought brilliantly with the forces available to him, the campaign's outcome was largely predetermined by the deceptions that had preceded it. The Allies established themselves in North Africa, creating the platform from which they would eventually invade Sicily and Italy. The dominoes had been set in motion, guided by invisible hands. The North African success created a feedback loop. Each successful deception increased German confidence in their intelligence networks, making them more vulnerable to the next manipulation. It's a principle intelligence agencies understood well. The best way to sell a big lie is to establish credibility with many small truths first. By the time the big deception comes, your target has lost the ability to distinguish it from the reliable information they've received before. But we've only scratched the surface. While Europe and North Africa dominated the headlines, another theatre of war was unfolding across the vast Pacific Ocean. And there too, double agents were working in the shadows, playing a very different but equally dangerous game. The Pacific War has often been characterized by its massive naval battles and brutal island campaigns. But beneath these headline operations ran a quieter war, one fought with intercepted codes, planted rumors, and carefully cultivated deceptions. The challenges here were unique. The cultural and linguistic barriers made infiltration far more difficult than in Europe. Yet both Allied and Japanese intelligence services managed to place agents in positions where they could influence critical decisions. Japanese intelligence operations were sophisticated, though history has often underestimated them. They had cultivated networks throughout Asia and the Pacific, and they believed these networks provided reliable information about Allied intentions. What they didn't fully grasp was that several of their most trusted sources had been compromised, not through dramatic captures or theatrical turnings, but through more subtle means: financial leverage, ideological persuasion, and in some cases the realization that Japan was going to lose the war. Allied intelligence in the Pacific operated differently than in Europe. The sheer distances involved, the difficulties of communication, meant that double agent operations had to be more independent, less centrally controlled. Agents in Australia, in India, in various Pacific islands operated with considerable autonomy. Their handlers couldn't micromanage every detail of every deception. This created both risks and opportunities. The risks were obvious. An unsupervised agent might go rogue or make mistakes. But the opportunities were significant too. These agents could respond to developing situations quickly, crafting deceptions tailored to local circumstances without waiting for approval from distant committees. One particularly effective operation involved misleading Japanese naval intelligence about American carrier movements. In naval warfare, knowing the location of enemy carriers is paramount. They're the most powerful weapons on the ocean, and their presence or absence determines the outcome of battles. Double agents provided carefully calibrated information that led Japanese planners to miscalculate where American carriers were positioned. Not dramatically wrong, that would have been suspicious. Just wrong enough that when battles developed, Japanese forces weren't optimally positioned to exploit their intelligence. The psychological impact of these deceptions extended beyond individual battles. Japanese command began to doubt their own intelligence apparatus. When reports didn't match reality, when American forces appeared where they weren't supposed to be, it created a climate of uncertainty. Decisions were delayed, resources were hedged rather than committed. The fog of war, already thick in the vast Pacific theater, became impenetrable. And in that fog, American forces operated with increasing confidence, while Japanese commanders grew more cautious. There's a particular incident that illustrates this perfectly, though it remained classified for decades after the war. In 1944, as American forces prepared to strike at the Philippines, Japanese intelligence received reports suggesting the main thrust would come further south. The source was considered reliable, a network that had provided accurate information previously. Japanese naval forces positioned accordingly. When MacArthur's invasion hit Leyte Gulf, Japanese carriers were hundreds of miles out of position. By the time they could respond, the Americans had already established air superiority. The Battle of Leyte Gulf became the largest naval battle in history and a decisive American victory. How much of that victory was due to the initial deception? We'll never know precisely, but the impact was undeniably significant. The Pacific deceptions had another dimension that's often overlooked. They affected Japanese resource allocation across their entire empire. Reports of Allied buildups in certain areas led to defensive preparations that drained resources from other theaters. Materials that could have reinforced critical islands were instead sent to locations the Allies had no intention of attacking. It was strategic judo, using the enemy's own strength and precautionary instincts against them. What's fascinating is how these operations evolved as the war progressed. Early in the Pacific War, deceptions were relatively simple: false radio traffic, planted rumors, basic misdirection. But by 1944 and 45, they'd become far more sophisticated. Allied intelligence had broken Japanese codes, giving them insight into what Japanese commanders believed and feared. This allowed them to craft deceptions that played directly into those fears, reinforcing Japanese misconceptions about Allied capabilities and intentions. The human cost of this shadow war is difficult to calculate. Double agents who were discovered faced horrific deaths. The Japanese approach to captured spies made German methods look merciful. Yet men and women continued to take these assignments knowing the risks. Some were motivated by ideology, others by revenge for Japanese atrocities. A few were simply patriots who believed their sacrifice might save countless lives. And they were right. Every successful deception, every misdirected Japanese division, every miscalculated naval deployment meant fewer Allied casualties when the actual attacks came. Don't go anywhere. The story takes an even darker turn. As the war ground toward its conclusion, the double-agent networks faced new challenges. Germany and Japan were losing, and their intelligence services knew it. Desperate regimes make desperate decisions, and intelligence agencies become paranoid. Several long-running double agents came under suspicion as Axis forces experienced repeated defeats. The 20 Committee had to work overtime to explain away Allied successes without exposing their agents. It was a delicate balance: make the agent look too incompetent, and they'd be recalled or eliminated; make them look too effective at actually helping the Axis, and they'd compromise Allied operations. This period saw some of the most brilliant improvisations in intelligence history. When a double agent's information seemed contradicted by events, handlers would craft elaborate explanations. Maybe the agent had been fed disinformation by Allied counterintelligence. Maybe their sub-agents had been unreliable. Maybe the Allies had changed plans at the last moment. Each explanation had to be plausible enough to maintain the agent's credibility while still serving Allied interests. It was exhausting, high-wire work where a single misstep could unravel years of careful deception. The legacy of these operations didn't end when the war did. In fact, the full story remained classified for decades. When British intelligence began declassifying documents about the double-cross system in the 1970s, historians were stunned. The official narrative of World War II had to be rewritten. Suddenly, famous victories looked different when you understood the deceptions that had preceded them. D-Day wasn't just a triumph of military planning and courage, it was a testament to the power of strategic deception. Rommel's defeats in North Africa weren't solely due to Allied material superiority. They were partly the result of systematic intelligence manipulation. This revelation created a fascinating problem for historians. How do you write the history of something that was deliberately hidden? How do you assess the impact of operations designed to leave no obvious trace? The documents that were declassified told part of the story, but they raised as many questions as they answered. How many other operations remained classified? How many double agents never came to light? The full accounting may never be possible. The Cold War, immediately following World War II, saw these techniques refined and expanded. The lessons learned from double-cross informed intelligence operations for decades. The CIA, KGB, MI6, and other agencies all studied the World War II deceptions carefully. They understood that in modern warfare, controlling what your enemy believes can be as important as controlling the battlefield itself. The nuclear age made this even more critical. When wars couldn't be fought directly without risking mutual annihilation, the intelligence war became the primary theater of competition. Consider how these principles manifest today. Cyber warfare is essentially an extension of the same concepts. You don't just steal information, you plant false information. You don't just defend your networks, you create honeypots that feed attackers false intelligence. Modern disinformation campaigns, whether conducted by state actors or others, use psychological principles pioneered by the double agents of World War II, confirm existing biases, layer truth with falsehood, create multiple seemingly independent sources saying the same thing. The technology has changed dramatically, but the fundamental approach remains the same. What makes this history particularly relevant now is the way information warfare has become democratized. During World War II, only major nation-states had the resources to run sophisticated double-agent networks. Today, relatively small groups can conduct information operations that reach millions of people. The techniques that once required recruiting and handling physical agents can now be executed through sock puppet accounts, deepfakes, and coordinated social media campaigns. The scale has changed, but the principles the double agents perfected remain disturbingly effective. There's an ethical dimension to this history that deserves consideration. Was it morally acceptable to conduct these deceptions? The answer seems obvious when we're talking about defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, regimes responsible for unspeakable atrocities. But the techniques themselves are morally neutral. They can be used by democracies against dictatorships, but also by dictatorships against democracies. The same methods that helped win World War II have been used to suppress dissent, manipulate elections, and undermine legitimate governments. The double agents themselves navigated complex ethical terrain. Many were deceiving governments they'd sworn allegiance to, even if for what they believed was a greater good. Some had genuine personal relationships with their handlers on both sides. Imagine the psychological toll of befriending someone while systematically lying to them, knowing your deception might eventually lead to their death. Several double agents suffered severe psychological problems after the war, struggling with guilt, identity confusion, and trauma from living dual lives under constant threat of exposure. Yet we can't ignore the lives saved by their work. If Operation Fortitude shortened the war by even a few months, it potentially saved hundreds of thousands of lives. If deceptions in North Africa reduced casualties during the invasions, those are real people who went home instead of dying in the desert. The moral calculus is complex, but the results speak for themselves. These operations worked. They changed the outcome of battles, campaigns, and ultimately the war itself. Before we continue, hit that like button if you're learning something new today. It really helps. The recruitment and training of double agents reveals fascinating insights into human psychology. What makes someone capable of living a double life under threat of death? Intelligence agencies discovered that the best candidates weren't necessarily the most patriotic or ideologically committed. They were people who could compartmentalize, who could maintain multiple contradictory realities simultaneously without psychological breakdown. They needed extraordinary memories to keep their false narratives consistent. They needed the emotional control to show genuine reactions while experiencing something entirely different internally. Training programs tried to prepare agents for the psychological stress, but nothing could fully simulate the reality. One former double agent described it as living in a state of permanent paranoia where you couldn't trust your own instincts because your instincts might blow your cover. Every interaction, every casual conversation, every moment had to be calculated. A slip in an unguarded moment could mean capture and execution. The stress was so intense that some agents had to be pulled out not because their cover was blown, but because they were psychologically collapsing under the strain. The handlers faced their own psychological challenges. They were sending people into mortal danger, manipulating them, lying to them about various aspects of their missions for security reasons. The relationship between handler and agent was intensely intimate, yet fundamentally based on deception and manipulation. Handlers had to maintain emotional distance while building trust. They had to be willing to sacrifice their agents if necessary for the greater operation. It was a role that required a particular kind of moral flexibility. What's remarkable is how many of these relationships survived after the war. Some handlers and agents remained in contact for decades, forming genuine friendships once the deceptions ended. Others couldn't maintain the relationship once the artificial structure was removed. A few agents felt betrayed when they learned the full extent of what had been kept from them during the war. The psychological literature on these relationships is sparse, as many participants were unwilling to discuss their experiences even after declassification. The technological infrastructure supporting double-agent operations was impressive for its time. Every message had to be crafted, approved, encoded, transmitted, and tracked. The 20 Committee maintained extensive files on every piece of information provided through double agents, ensuring consistency across years of communications. They had to remember what Agent X had supposedly seen in March 1942 when crafting a message in July 1944. Any inconsistency could trigger German suspicions. The encoding and transmission infrastructure was equally complex. Messages had to appear to be using the codes and protocols expected by German intelligence. This meant Allied cryptographers had to understand German systems well enough to produce authentic-looking traffic. Radio operators had to match the FIST, the distinctive sending pattern, of the agents they were impersonating. German signals intelligence was sophisticated enough to detect anomalies, so every detail had to be perfect. As we approach the end of this story, it's worth reflecting on what these operations tell us about the nature of warfare itself. We like to think of war as a contest of strength, courage, and material resources, and those things certainly matter, but World War II demonstrated that perception can be as powerful as reality. An army that thinks it faces invasion at point A will position itself accordingly, regardless of whether that invasion is real. A commander who believes his intelligence network is reliable will make decisions based on that intelligence, even if it's false. The double agents of World War II were warriors in a battle most people didn't know was happening. They didn't carry guns or fly planes. Their weapons were words, their battlefield was the enemy's mind, and their victories, while invisible, were as significant as any won on conventional battlefields. They proved that in modern warfare, controlling the narrative can be as important as controlling the territory. The full roster of double agents involved in these operations has never been completely disclosed. Some agents' identities remain classified even today, nearly 80 years after the war ended. The reasons vary. Some agents or their families requested anonymity. Some operations remain too sensitive to discuss publicly even now, and some documents were simply lost or destroyed in the decades since the war. We're left with an incomplete picture of a massive, complex operation that fundamentally changed military history. What we do know is that dozens of agents, possibly hundreds, participated in various capacities. Some ran major operations lasting years, others contributed smaller pieces to the puzzle, providing specific intelligence at critical moments. Each had a story, a motivation, a reason for accepting the terrifying risks involved. Each made calculations about what they were willing to sacrifice for victory, and collectively their work created one of the most successful intelligence operations in human history. The impact on post-war intelligence cannot be overstated. Every major intelligence service studied the double-cross system intensively. The Soviet Union, despite being allied with Britain during the war, was intensely curious about how the British had managed it. They attempted to replicate the techniques with varying success. The Americans incorporated the lessons into CIA doctrine. The Israelis, building their intelligence services in the late 1940s, drew heavily on British experience and even recruited former British intelligence officers as advisors. This diffusion of knowledge meant that by the Cold War, all major powers understood the value and methodology of strategic deception. The result was an intelligence arms race where each side tried to deceive the other while avoiding being deceived themselves. Trust became impossible. Intelligence had to be verified through multiple sources and methods, and every piece of information was examined for potential deception. The paranoia was justified. Every intelligence service was actively trying to deceive every other intelligence service. The psychological warfare dimension evolved as well. Governments realized that populations could be targeted with the same techniques used against military commanders. Radio broadcasts, planted newspaper stories, cultural infiltration, all became tools of strategic deception. The goal wasn't necessarily to make people believe specific falsehoods, but to create enough confusion and doubt that they couldn't distinguish truth from fiction. A disoriented population is easier to manipulate than an informed one. We see this today in the information environment we all inhabit. The techniques are more sophisticated, the scale is global, and the speed is instantaneous. but the underlying principles remain the same as those pioneered by the double agents of World War II. Create multiple sources saying the same thing, mix truth with falsehood, confirm existing biases, exploit emotional vulnerabilities. The technology changes, but human psychology remains remarkably consistent. One final thought before we close: the story of these double agents is ultimately about human capacity. The capacity for deception, yes, but also for courage, cleverness, and sacrifice. These were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet them. They lived with fear, stress, and moral ambiguity. They made impossible choices with incomplete information, and they succeeded beyond anyone's reasonable expectations. Their legacy is complex. They helped win a war against genuine evil, which is unambiguously good, but they also perfected techniques that have since been used for less noble purposes. They demonstrated that reality is malleable, that perception can be engineered, that truth itself can become a weapon. These are dangerous lessons in the wrong hands, yet they're also necessary lessons for anyone trying to defend against deception. The full truth about these operations will probably never be known. Too much time has passed. Too many participants have died. Too many documents remain classified or have been destroyed. What we're left with is a fragmentary narrative, pieces of a vast puzzle that we can never completely assemble. But even this incomplete picture is enough to change how we understand World War II and modern warfare itself. The unseen architects rewrote history not with grand gestures, but with careful, patient manipulation. They understood that you don't need to control the battlefield if you can control what your enemy believes about the battlefield. They proved that information is power in its most literal sense, and they created a template for intelligence operations that remains relevant today. So the next time you hear about World War II, remember that the story is more complicated than heroic narratives suggest. Remember the shadow war fought by people whose names we'll never know. Remember that some of the most important victories happened in enemy headquarters, in the minds of German and Japanese commanders who never realized they'd been deceived. The tanks and planes and ships mattered, obviously, but so did the lies carefully constructed and brilliantly delivered by the double agents who changed history. If this story fascinated you, if it changed how you see history and modern warfare, do me a favor. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates complex, hidden history. There are so many more stories like this waiting to be told, operations that remained secret for decades, individuals who changed the world without anyone knowing. The past is far stranger and more interesting than we usually acknowledge, and together we can uncover more of it. The war ended in 1945, but the secrets kept for decades beyond. And even now, 80 years later, we're still learning just how much the double agents influenced the outcome. Their work was the ultimate force multiplier, turning enemy intelligence networks into weapons against those who built them. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. And it worked. That's the legacy of the unseen architects, the double agents who rewrote World War II's blueprint and changed history forever.